In 1147, when King Louis VII of France set out on the Second Crusade, he carried much more than an army with him. He also carried a massive burden of debt. To pay for the campaign, Louis VII asked the Abbey of Saint-Denis near Paris for financial support. The abbot, Suger, agreed to lend the king the money, but he wanted something in return. When the king came back, he would repay the loan with interest. A king was going to fight for God in a holy war, yet at the same time, he was being recorded in the church's financial books as a debtor. It sounds strange, doesn't it? When we think about the Crusades, the first things that come to mind are religious passion, knights fighting for the Holy Land, and a war fought in the name of God. But behind this great religious story was a much colder and more calculated reality. The Crusades were one of the largest and most complex financial operations in history. Before armies could even begin to march, banks, taxes, mortgages, and debt agreements were already involved. So how do you finance a war, even if it is called holy? And how did this financial system completely change Europe's economy, legal system, and even banking over the next 2 centuries? This is a story told not by prayer books, but by account books. The story begins in 1095. Pope Urban II gathered a great church council in Clermont, France, and made a call that would change the course of history. He called on Christians to liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. The crowd answered with excitement, shouting, "Deus vult," God wills it. But this call had one practical problem. Sending thousands of soldiers, together with their horses, weapons, and supplies, to a land thousands of kilometers away, required an enormous amount of money. A fully equipped knight was worth a small fortune in today's money. On top of that, these knights would travel for months or even years, and they had to feed both themselves and their men during the journey. Pope Urban did not ignore this practical reality. The council also included a financial incentive. Anyone who joined the crusade would have the interest on their debts suspended. It seemed like a simple decision, but it was revolutionary. At that time, many European nobles had borrowed money from Jewish moneylenders or Italian bankers, and often struggled with high interest rates. Joining a crusade became a way to escape this financial burden. Some historians even argue that the desire to get rid of debt pushed many knights to join the Crusades just as much as religious passion did. To understand the Crusades, we first need to understand that the medieval church was not only a religious institution, but also an enormous economic power. The church was the largest landowner in Europe. According to some estimates, during the 12th century, nearly 1/3 of the land in Western Europe was directly or indirectly controlled by the church. Monasteries were not only places where monks prayed, they were also farming businesses, lending centers, and financial institutions. To finance the Crusades, the church developed several methods, and each of them permanently changed Europe's financial system in the centuries that followed. The first method was direct taxation. In 1166, King Henry II of England and King Louis VII of France introduced a special tax known as the Saladin tithe. This tax required 1/10 of all income and movable property to be used directly for financing the Crusades. It became one of the first large-scale direct income taxes ever recorded in European history. As expected, it caused great anger. People began to question whether it was fair to pay for a religious campaign with their own money. The second method was the sale of indulgences. The church promised forgiveness of sins to those who joined the Crusades or supported them financially. Over time, this system became a direct way to buy forgiveness through payment. A wealthy noble who could not personally join the campaign could send soldiers or contribute money and receive the same spiritual reward. This was one of the clearest examples of a religious practice becoming a financial tool. The third method, and perhaps the least well known, was that the church entered the business of lending money. Monasteries and church institutions gave loans to nobles who planned to join the Crusades, using their land as collateral. If the noble never returned from the campaign, which happened quite often, the land became church property. This system quietly but effectively helped the church expand its land holdings year after year. It would be impossible to talk about the financing of the Crusades without mentioning the Knights Templar, because they were one of the most important parts of the story. Founded in 1119, this military and religious order was originally created to protect pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. Over time, however, it developed into one of the most advanced financial networks in history. The system created by the Templars looked surprisingly similar to modern banking. A crusader could deposit money at a Templar house in Europe, receive a type of written receipt, and then collect the same money from another Templar branch after arriving in the Holy Land. This was similar to today's traveler's checks or international money transfer systems, and it was happening in the 12th century, long before any central banking system existed. The Templars quickly built an enormous network of wealth and land. They managed thousands of properties across Europe, lent money to kings and nobles, and even took responsibility for managing the treasuries of some kingdoms. For a period of time, the treasury of the French king was kept inside the Templar fortress in Paris. Think about that. An order created for a holy war had become Europe's most powerful financial institution within only 2 centuries. Ironically, that same power also led to their downfall. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, who owed the Templars a large amount of money, accused the order of heresy, arrested its leaders, and seized its property. Most historians believe this was not a genuine religious investigation, but rather a way for the king to erase his debts and take control of the Templars' enormous wealth. An institution created for a holy war eventually became a victim of its own financial power. Perhaps the best example of the financial side of the Crusades was the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The campaign was originally planned to attack Egypt, but to carry out the plan, the Crusaders needed to rent ships from Venice. The Republic of Venice demanded 85,000 silver marks from them, an unbelievable amount of money at that time. When the Crusader army arrived in Venice, they could not collect enough money to pay. Although the Venetians were supporting a religious mission, they refused to change the terms of their business agreement. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, made a clever but very dishonest offer. If the Crusaders could not pay their debt with cash, they could instead help Venice capture Zara, a Christian city that was one of Venice's commercial rivals. This meant that an army fighting a holy war would attack another Christian city simply to repay its debt. Pope Innocent III was horrified and excommunicated the army. But under heavy financial pressure, the Crusaders still attacked and looted Zara, and the story did not end there. After that, the army was redirected toward Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the richest and most magnificent Christian city in the world at that time. Once again, financial promises and debt problems were the main reason. In 1204, an army that was supposed to reach the Holy Land instead looted one of Christianity's greatest cities. The enormous treasures, works of art, and holy relics of Constantinople were taken to Western Europe, while the city itself was brutally looted for 3 days. This was one of the greatest ironies in the history of the Crusades. A campaign that began in the name of religion ended up destroying one of the greatest centers of its own faith because of financial interests. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered from this blow, and it helped prepare the way for the empire's conquest by the Ottomans 2 centuries later. This huge financial machine did not operate only at the level of kings and knights. Ordinary people paid the highest price for these holy wars. The burden of taxation fell on the peasants. When a knight joined a crusade, he often collected extra taxes from the peasants living on his land or used their property as collateral. There was an even darker reality. In some regions, the financing of the Crusades became directly connected with violence against Jewish communities. Before and during the First Crusade, some Crusader groups in the Rhineland attacked local Jewish communities before leaving for the campaign. They seized their property and used the stolen wealth to pay for the journey. These attacks were driven by both religious hatred and simple financial opportunism. Some nobles who wanted to erase their debts to Jewish moneylenders saw this violence as a solution. This is one of the harshest realities behind the often romanticized story of the Crusades. Armies that claimed to fight for a holy cause often used methods that completely contradicted their own principles in order to finance their campaigns. The event known as the Children's Crusade in 1212 was perhaps the most tragic example of this mix of religion and finance. According to the traditional story, thousands of children and young people, filled with religious faith, set out without weapons or equipment, believing they could peacefully free the Holy Land through the power of their belief. Historians still debate what really happened. Some believe the group was made up mostly of poor and landless travelers rather than actual children, but one fact is certain. Most of these people never reached the Holy Land. Some died from hunger and disease along the way. Others were tricked by merchants who promised to transport them by ship, but instead sold them into slavery. This event shows how the Crusades became part of a much larger system of exploitation. Religion, hope, poverty, and the desire for profit became so closely connected that even the most innocent intentions could become victims of ruthless financial greed. At this point, I would like to pause for a moment and mention something. On this channel, we continue to explore these complex and often oversimplified periods of history in depth. Feel free to share in the comments which part of this story surprised you the most. The side that benefited the most from the Crusades was not actually any of the armies fighting. Italian maritime republics such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa gained enormous wealth during these 2 centuries of conflict. These cities rented ships to Crusader armies, sold supplies, provided weapons, and gained early access to new trade networks in the war zones. We have already seen Venice's role in the Fourth Crusade, but that was only one example. Genoa and Pisa also established trading colonies along the coasts of present-day Lebanon, Israel, and Syria. These colonies opened the door to trade routes that carried Eastern spices, silk, and luxury goods into Europe. There is a strange twist in history here. The Crusades began as religious wars, but their most lasting effect was not military, it was commercial. Because of these campaigns, Europe developed much stronger trade connections with the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. Spices, silk, sugar, and many products that had previously been unknown in Europe reached the West through these trade routes. By controlling this trade, the Italian city-states built the wealth that would later help finance the Renaissance. The financial burden of the Crusades affected not only individual knights but also entire kingdoms. When King Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart, joined the Third Crusade, the campaign placed an enormous financial burden on his country. Things became even worse when Richard was captured by the Duke of Austria during his return journey. A ransom of 150,000 silver marks was demanded for his release, about twice the annual income of England. To raise this ransom, England launched an extraordinary tax campaign. Churches were forced to melt down their gold and silver treasures. Additional taxes were collected from the people. It was a powerful example of how one king's personal adventure could damage an entire kingdom's economy for many years. Behind Richard's heroic image was a financial crisis that lasted long after the campaign ended. By the end of the 13th century, the military goals of the Crusades had largely failed. In 1291, with the fall of the city of Acre, the Crusaders lost their last major stronghold in the Holy Land. After 2 centuries of fighting that cost tens of thousands of lives, the campaigns ended with Muslim powers keeping permanent control of the region. But the most lasting legacy of the Crusades was not found on the battlefield. It could be seen in Europe's financial and administrative systems. Tax systems were directly influenced by the methods developed to finance the Crusades, permanently strengthening the ability of kingdoms to collect taxes through centralized governments. The international credit and money transfer systems developed by the Knights Templar became early models for the banking systems that would grow in later centuries. The wealth accumulated by the Italian city-states directly helped finance the artistic and intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. In other words, a war that began in the name of religion transformed Europe not through military victory, but through economic change. The Holy Land was never permanently liberated, but the financial infrastructure created during these campaigns became one of the foundations of modern Europe. The story of the Crusades teaches us something remarkable. Even the greatest ideals are often closely connected with a much simpler reality: money. The Pope's holy call required the solution to an enormous logistical and financial problem. and the process of solving that problem permanently changed banking, taxation, and international trade. The next time you hear the words, the Crusades, do not think only about swords, armor, and religious passion. Also remember the account books, debt records, and tax systems that almost pushed entire kingdoms into bankruptcy. Because these campaigns were not only holy wars, they were also massive financial operations. And perhaps one of history's greatest lessons is this: no matter how noble a movement may seem at the beginning, it always faces the same question in the end: who is going to pay for it? If this story surprised you as much as it surprised me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every week, we explore new stories about how religion, money, and power have shaped history together. And I'm curious, what surprised you more? The banking system of the Knights Templar, or the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople? Let me know in the comments.